Hello and welcome to another Art House movie review. This time I'm reviewing the film Brainwashed, directed by Nina Menkes. So I saw a screening of this documentary at the BFI where Nina was actually present for a short introduction before the film and the Q&A afterwards, and so it was an ideal way to see it. So I'll be totally honest, I'd never heard of Nina Menkes, and so this documentary was the first introduction to her work. But she's actually a filmmaker that's made a number of really interesting films, and the BFI, thank God for the BFI, it's amazing, has had a season of 6 of her films, so we've had the opportunity to see the bulk of her main work. So after watching the documentary, the last couple of weeks I've watched all 6 of her films, and I am really shocked that I didn't know her. And it kind of proves one of the points in her documentary, that the film industry is so dominated by males. It's so difficult for a woman to make films, especially experimental films that are trying to work outside of the orthodoxy and conventions. It's just outrageous that I didn't know her work, and I'm so glad. I'm so thankful that she's made this documentary, and to the BFI for showing the season of her films, because I rank her amongst the best. I've done a separate review of her films. She was introduced before the film as one of the greatest living auteurs, and I slightly balked when I heard this. This is quite an introduction, but having watched the films, I agree. She ranks amongst the very best. And you'll hear what I've got to say about her filmmaking in the other review. This is a really important documentary. I would say it has changed the way I look at films. I find that since watching it, I'm always more aware of the issues that this film addresses. And I think that's the highest praise for a work that I can give when I say it's changed the way I see the world. Nina's written and lectured on her views and analysis of the male-dominated film industry, and this lecture was turned into this documentary, and it's a thorough exploration of the impact of the male gaze and the objectification of women, both on films and for the opportunities of women in the filmmaking industry. So she takes us through this detailed analysis with many different examples from lots of very well-known films, looking at things like who is the object and who is the subject, how is the shot framed, how does the camera move, how's the shot lit, and what's the narrative position? Who are we listening? Who are we hearing in relation to where they are on the screen? And she shows us examples of how, for all of these things, there's a difference in the way that men and women are portrayed. And there really is an orthodoxy that most people in the film industry follow, including female directors. She shows us blatant and shocking examples that are just so incredible when you see them together. There's a scene from Blade Runner where the Harrison Ford character Deckard refuses to let Rachel leave, and he slams the door violently. She wants to leave, and then the music changes and they're kissing, and it's just, to see it in that different context, it is shocking. There's another scene, really interesting scene from Raging Bull by the swimming pool, where we're hearing 2 sets of conversations between men, but there's a woman speaking that's actually closer than one of the group of men, and her conversation is muffled. And again, it's just a really interesting observation of something that I'd never noticed in a film I've seen a number of times. On the other hand, she shows an excellent example from Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where we have a subject and an object, but then Sciamma plays with the use of 2 subjects when one is painting the other, and the subject turns into object, and it just has much more awareness around object. And the film is full of these kind of examples that just make you, just as a student of film and learning about filmmaking myself and interested in filmmaking, it really was very helpful in terms of being fully aware of what we do when we are framing shots. She talks about this triangle and links between this visual language of cinema, which she analyses, and then the employment of women and discrimination in the film industry, and then the third aspect, sexual harassment. Now, the film is really thorough in terms of the visual language, and she does provide some statistics on women in film which are really convincing around the sexual harassment, and the link between the visual language of cinema and the male gaze and sexual harassment of women is more asserted rather than given the same level of rigorous analysis. That said, with this kind of blatant objectification so rampant in the film industry, this definitely conditions the way that as men we see women in the real world. So although I'm saying she's only making assertions on sexual harassment, it is probably true what she's saying, but it just felt less rigorous because her work is kind of so scholarly and referenced around the visual language. After seeing the documentary, but before seeing her films, there were two things I was slightly unsure about. So the documentary is made with this lecture format where there's an audience and a screen, and Nina kind of is sometimes sitting in the audience, sometimes standing on the stage, and sometimes standing between the audience and the screen. And so she's very much present in the film. And on reflecting after the documentary, I kind of thought, she's in the film too much. This film isn't about Nina. The subject is too important and the work is too important for it to be about her. I also had a slightly similar feeling with the fact that she included quite a few clips of her own work, and at this point I didn't know her work at all, so it just felt like it was egotistical to be showing her work alongside all the greats that she was showing in the documentary. However, after seeing her films, I've changed my view. I love her work, and after watching the films, I watched the documentary again and I viewed it differently. I think it's incredible that she's so little known and not kind of mentioned in lists of the greatest filmmakers. This documentary has perhaps been bigger than any of her other films, and it's been screened on the art house circuit in the UK. So who could blame her for using the film to become a bit better known? I don't think that's what she's done, but it's a totally reasonable bonus that comes from the film. One other critique that I'd make of the documentary is the use of music in it. The music is very dramatic, and it's always the kind of music like the uncovering of a conspiracy and a big drama. And for me, the evidence in this film that she presents is so strong. I just felt, let me judge it. I don't need the music to kind of emphasize the drama of what we're seeing. But what this does do is make it entertaining. And I guess that this perhaps opens it up to a bigger audience. And it's important that this film is seen by as many people as possible, I think. At one level, it's kind of ridiculous that I want it to be more scholarly and less Hollywood. But actually, the message is so important that maybe the Hollywood frame is actually helpful in getting the film out there. I enjoyed listening to the Q&A and where she gave a bit more background, and I've read some of her writings and watched some interviews, and I think it's interesting that she's not actually saying that films with a male gaze shouldn't be made. Her point is that this point of view is just so dominant that there should be alternatives. And there's not many examples. And that's why her work is really important, because it is an example of someone who has tried to do something very different than the dominant approach to filmmaking. I think the documentary is a really interesting way into Nina's work, because when you get an idea of her observations of the film industry, when you watch her films, that lens is really useful in understanding what she's trying to do in her work and how she's made her films differently. In conclusion, This is a really important documentary. It's an absolute must see. It's very convincing. And as I say, it's changed the way I view films. I would highly recommend it. Look out for the review on her other films. Thanks for watching. See you next time.